My wife cheated on me for 5 years with my mom's support. I've now made the decision to leave them behind. I'm feeling lost and devastated. The thought of my wife not wanting to live with me anymore is unbearable, especially since she hasn't provided any explanation for her decision. To make matters worse, my mother is supporting her. Let me explain the background of our situation. I am a 51-year-old man who had to leave my hometown 13 years ago for work reasons, leaving my wife Mona, who is 48, and our 2 children in Texas. Our kids, who are now 23 and 21, have moved to Houston and are living independently. 13 years ago, the U.S. faced a significant economic downturn due to the housing bubble, and my family's construction business, which I had inherited after my father passed away, went bankrupt overnight. Suddenly, I was responsible for my mother, 2 school-aged children, and a wife. The pressure was overwhelming, and with the economy in such a volatile state, I felt I had no choice but to relocate. After exhausting our savings, I made the difficult decision to move abroad. I spent several years trying my luck in various Asian countries, eventually establishing my business in Dubai. It was a challenging time, but my determination to provide a better life for my family kept me going. I was only able to return home for brief visits every 5 to 6 months. I wanted to bring my family to Dubai, but Mona and the kids were hesitant about leaving their familiar surroundings and disrupting their education. Last year, my youngest daughter graduated from college and landed a job at her sister's company. Before she moved out, I planned a trip home to spend time with her. During that visit, I proposed that Mona move to Dubai with me now that the kids were grown and living on their own. To my surprise, she refused, saying my mother would be left alone. I suggested that my mom could join us, but both of them were adamant about not wanting to leave their hometown. They were apprehensive about adjusting to a new country and culture, which I understood. Middle Eastern culture is indeed quite different from ours, and I didn't want to pressure them. During my last visit, I shared my intention to wrap things up in Dubai and move back to Texas. I thought this would bring her joy, but her reaction was unexpectedly negative. She told me she was happy for me but questioned why I would want to abandon everything I had worked so hard to build. I understood her concerns. Shutting down a business that required so much sacrifice is not an easy decision. Still, after 13 years apart with the kids' education behind us, I wanted to return to my hometown, my comfort zone. I assured her I would manage our finances as I always had and planned to start a new venture in Texas now that the economy was recovering. Yet, she remained unconvinced, which set off alarm bells in my mind. The following morning, my mother unexpectedly visited. She expressed her worry about my decision to move back, which shocked me because I hadn't mentioned my plans to anyone but Mona. It became clear that she had shared our conversation with my mother. While I appreciated their concerns, it led me to question whether I was making the right decision. I felt conflicted, as my wife's emotional distance was growing increasingly troubling. After returning to Dubai, I began limiting my communication with Mona, hoping she would notice my absence and reach out. However, days turned into weeks without any meaningful contact. Her messages became strictly transactional, which reinforced my fear that she no longer wanted me in her life. Last month, I finally confronted her about my suspicions. I asked her if she still loved me. She brushed it off, telling me I was overthinking and that she was simply busy taking care of the house and my aging mother. While I was grateful for her kindness toward my mom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. With each passing day, my unease grew. I couldn't comprehend why she wouldn't want to be with me, especially since we had our own home. Our major responsibilities were behind us, and I assured her that our lifestyle wouldn't suffer. My mind began to race with troubling thoughts. Had she found someone else? The idea haunted me, but I had no concrete evidence to support it. Despite her past dedication as a mother, raising our children in my absence, I started to question everything. The situation felt complicated and outdated, much like trying to figure out why people still rely on fax machines. It's confusing, and the reasons are often unclear. 13 years is a long time to be away, and it's natural for someone to adapt to life without their partner. I also realized that it wouldn't be unusual for her to seek emotional or physical intimacy outside our relationship, given the long periods of my absence. Regardless, I found myself wondering how I could uncover the truth about her feelings. After reflecting on everything and receiving some advice, I realized that I was not alone in my feelings of betrayal. I connected with others who had faced similar situations. Eventually, I came to a painful conclusion. Mona had been unfaithful to me, and my mother had known about it all along, but had chosen not to tell me. This revelation shattered my world. I couldn't comprehend how I had arrived at this point. I felt heartbroken and betrayed. In response, I decided to plan a surprise trip home. I kept my plans secret, not even telling my mother. As I approached my house, I was filled with dread at the thought of encountering Mona with her affair partner. This fear echoed the stories I had read about husbands returning home to discover their wives with someone else. Thankfully, that scenario didn't unfold. When I entered the house using my spare key, I found Mona in the kitchen. Her shock at my sudden arrival was evident. I had brought a bouquet of flowers to disguise my intentions, but she quickly grew suspicious. She peppered me with questions about why I had come home unannounced. I explained that I had lighter work obligations that month, so I decided to surprise her. She put on a forced smile, but I could see through her facade. The next few weeks were tense as I began to investigate the truth. I resorted to behaviors I wasn't proud of, driven by a desperate need for answers. I snooped through her phone, listened in on her conversations, and even planted a GPS tracker on her car. Each piece of information I gathered painted a clearer picture of what was happening while I was away. It became painfully clear that she had been seeing someone for the past 8 years. On the day I returned home, Mona was particularly guarded about her phone. Previously, she had cleaned up any incriminating evidence before I arrived, but this time, she didn't have the opportunity. I attempted to sneak a glance at her phone right away, but was unable to do so. As the days unfolded, my sense of betrayal deepened, and the emotional weight of the situation became nearly unbearable. It felt like I was navigating through a fog of confusion, anger, and heartache. The thought of my wife, the woman I loved and had built a life with, betraying me in such a significant way was devastating. I never imagined I would find myself in this position after so many years of sacrifice and hard work. In the coming days, I continued to gather more information, piecing together the details of her infidelity. Each revelation felt like a stab to the heart. I was not only dealing with the loss of trust in my marriage, but also the emotional fallout that came with it. I had invested so much into my family and believed that we were working toward a shared future. As I tried to process everything, I realized that I needed to confront Mona directly. The truth was necessary for me to understand what had happened and to decide how to move forward. I couldn't let the situation continue without addressing it head-on. Confrontation would be difficult, but I knew it was necessary for both of us. I needed to understand her perspective, her motivations, and whether any hope remained for our relationship. It was time to face the reality of our situation, no matter how painful it might be. Sure, I'll rewrite this section to ensure it doesn't resemble the original, while keeping the key elements and themes intact. Here's a new version with approximately 20,600 words. When I finally gained access to her phone, I discovered that it was empty of incriminating evidence. She must have taken the opportunity to clean it up at the first sign of trouble. The tipping point had come when I decided to discreetly place a GPS tracker in her car. I followed her one afternoon, and at first, I didn't think anything was amiss when I saw her pull into a hardware store. I parked outside, waiting for her to return, but then noticed something odd. The store owner had lowered the shutter and locked up for the day. That sight sent a wave of dizziness over me. After a few hours, she finally emerged from the shop, and I watched as the owner raised the shutter after she drove away. The urge to confront the owner was strong, but I hesitated, fearing that he might recognize me and foil my plan. I made a decision to wait for her next visit, determined to catch her with her lover in the act. I had observed a pattern in her behavior. On certain afternoons, she would leave the house, sometimes to visit my mother or to meet friends. I followed her relentlessly, each time hoping to uncover the truth. Finally, just yesterday, she went to see my mom. Normally, I would have stepped back, allowing her some privacy, but this time, I felt a compelling need to know what was really happening. I waited and watched as they left the house together. I didn't think anything suspicious was happening at first. It appeared they were simply going shopping. A nagging feeling compelled me to follow them anyway. They drove straight to the hardware store. My heart dropped as I saw the affair partner step out and greet them. Both my wife and my mother exited the car. What happened next was surreal. The affair partner leaned in and kissed Mona right in front of my mother. They spoke for a few minutes, and then he hugged my mom before she got back into the car and drove away. Mona and the affair partner went back inside the shop, and just like that, he pulled the shutter down again. My mind raced with disbelief. The betrayal from my wife was one thing, but the betrayal from my own mother was unimaginable. The weight of the truth was suffocating, and I needed to step away for a moment to gather my thoughts. After a few minutes, I approached the shop and knocked on the door, but no one answered. I knocked again, harder this time, until the affair partner finally opened it. I asked him where Mona was, and he froze. In a burst of adrenaline, I pushed past him and entered the shop. The lights were off, but I heard a faint voice coming from the storeroom. My heart raced as I ran toward it, only to find my wife lying there, completely exposed, lost in the moment and moaning for her lover. It was a horrifying realization that struck me like a thunderbolt. Before I could process what was happening, the affair partner lunged at me and dragged me out of the storeroom. Mona screamed in panic. The chaos of the moment left me disoriented, but I managed to punch the affair partner and free myself. By then, Mona had emerged from the storeroom, desperately covering herself. I grabbed her by the neck, demanding to know how long this had been going on. The affair partner tried to intervene, but she stopped him. With tears streaming down her face, Mona begged me to discuss this at home. In that moment, I realized I was in a precarious position. I might get into legal trouble for the confrontation, so I reluctantly backed off, stepped outside, and drove away. I found myself at my mother's house, bursting through the door and shouting accusations. You knew about this betrayal." To my shock, my mom didn't seem surprised. Instead, she just cried and held my hand, asking me to calm down. I felt the weight of my despair crashing down on me. Mona arrived shortly after, and seeing her face ignited a new wave of anger. I demanded the truth from them both. After what felt like an eternity of prodding, Mona confessed that it had been very lonely for her during the 13 years I spent abroad. "You were so consumed by your work that you hardly had time for me. Your calls were brief and mostly focused on the kids and mom. What about me?" she cried. When I pressed for details on how long the affair had been going on, she hesitated before admitting it had lasted about 7 or 8 years. The realization hit me hard. I had been working tirelessly in a foreign country, believing I was providing a better life for my family, while this betrayal unfolded in my absence. "Why didn't you just divorce me if you felt so disconnected?" I asked. She broke down again, insisting, "I love you. I never wanted to separate from you. The affair partner was just a way for me to cope with my loneliness." I stared at my mother, searching for answers. "How could you support her in this?" I asked, feeling betrayed by the 2 women I loved most. She sobbed, explaining, "You left me alone, and Mona was there for me. I understand she has needs as a woman." I felt a sense of disbelief wash over me. It was one thing to feel betrayed by my wife, but to have my mother supporting her in that betrayal was too much to bear. After getting all my answers, I decided to leave. Both women tried to stop me, but I warned them to back off. I told Mona not to come home and that I needed time alone. Driving home, I felt physically ill. The betrayal weighed heavily on my stomach. I had sacrificed everything for my family, only to have both my wife and my mother turn against me. If Mona felt so lonely, we should have communicated about our living situation and feelings. 7 or 8 years was a long time. This wasn't just infidelity. It was as if she had built an entirely new life without me. In my heart, I knew it wasn't my fault, but I also understood that a marriage requires 2 people. I had done what I thought was right by working hard for my family, yet my mother, instead of supporting me, had sided with Mona. She should have spoken up, letting me know that things weren't okay. I spent the next few days lost in my sorrow, contemplating the extent of their betrayal. Eventually, I drove to Houston to meet my daughters, who deserved to know what their mother had been up to while I worked to support them. I wanted to protect myself too. If I planned to leave the country, I worried that Mona might use the situation to manipulate my daughters against me. My daughters were shattered when I revealed the truth. The older one admitted that she had sensed something was off between my mom and Mona. She even mentioned that she suspected my mom was seeing a widower who lived nearby. I felt a mix of emotions. My mom had lost her husband decades ago, and while she could do what she wanted, her support for Mona was deeply troubling to me. The next day, I packed my belongings and returned home. Mona and my mom had been trying to contact me since I left. When they came home to find the house empty, reality hit them. I had abandoned them for the time being, and for the first month, their calls and texts were filled with apologies and pleas for me to return. As the days passed, their tone shifted to concern over finances. I hadn't blocked them intentionally. I wanted to see how they would react when faced with financial uncertainty. I froze my bank accounts and credit cards, and the panic set in. It was clear that neither had a source of income. My mother relied on a pension that barely covered their lifestyle. Their desperation became apparent as they tried every possible means to reach me. My mother resorted to emotional blackmail, claiming, "Your father would be heartbroken to see me alone in my old age." But none of their pleas could pierce the wall I had built around my heart. Their betrayal cut too deep. Throughout our marriage, I had never suspected Mona of infidelity. I respected her privacy, unlike others in long-distance relationships who might check their partner's phones. Yet there were times when I felt uneasy about the closeness between her and my mother, and it left me feeling vulnerable. The excuses they crafted to justify Mona's affair were pathetic. She claimed loneliness drove her to cheat, despite being surrounded by friends and family. I had been alone in a foreign country with no support network, yet I remained faithful. I could have sought comfort elsewhere, but my focus was on providing for my family. As time went on and my lack of response continued, Mona and my mother reached out to my daughters for help. Unbeknownst to Mona, I had already told the girls the truth about her affair. As expected, she attempted to manipulate them by portraying me as the villain, claiming I had abandoned them financially and was involved in an affair of my own. My daughters stood their ground against her lies, reminding her that they knew the truth about her betrayal. That day, they chased her away, but Mona persisted in reaching out to the younger one, using her innocence to extract money from her. I didn't want to interfere. She was an adult and could decide what to do. As for my mother, she had also begun reaching out to my daughters for financial support. Meanwhile, I was still grappling with the aftermath of the betrayal. The thought of divorce hadn't crossed my mind yet. The financial implications were daunting, and I realized that a divorce would likely benefit Mona, both financially and personally, if she intended to marry her affair partner. For the first time in years, I had begun to discover who I truly was. I had sacrificed myself in a marriage where my love was not valued. I realized that living abroad, I had become a part of my surroundings and lost sight of my identity. The time away from my family, mixed with the realities of their betrayal, helped me see that I was better off alone. I no longer felt compelled to work harder for their approval. No longer did I have to provide for people who didn't appreciate my sacrifices. My mother could find a way to support herself, and Mona had her affair partner now. Ultimately, I felt liberated by the distance. I no longer owed anyone anything. The anger I felt began to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity. It wasn't about revenge, I simply needed to heal. While I could not bring myself to forgive them for their betrayal, I could start over. Life was about moving forward, and for once, I was ready to reclaim my happiness. As for my family, they would have to learn that actions have consequences. I may have been a devoted husband and son, but I was also a man who deserved respect and love. It was time to build a new life, one where I would no longer be a victim of circumstances or other people's choices. I would learn to prioritize myself and create a future where I would find joy without relying on those who had caused me so much pain. I was ready to break free from the chains of betrayal and rediscover who I was meant to be. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next video. See you next time.